Welcome everybody to the first of our series of speakers for the spring series of the Natural Resources and Environmental Policy Forum. This is an event that we've had going on. This is our third school year that we've been doing these policy forums. We convene this through the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy here at the university in partnership with a lot of other entities. And I just want to mention them: the School of Law, the School of Forestry and Conservation, the Boley Center for People and Forests, the Resource Conservation Program, Department of Geography, Environmental Studies Program, Department of History, H.D. Hampton Lecture, Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and I want to give credit to the MCAT, which tapes these programs, rebroadcasts them locally, and helps us post them for people who aren't able to be here. I'd like to give special thanks again to the School of Law for hosting us and providing a lot of the audiovisual and publicity support that we enjoy. We have 3 speakers coming this spring, all excellent. I've posted some information here on the whiteboard. We've also got handouts circulating. Our next speaker is on March 22nd. It's an evening program, so note the different time and place for that. But today's topic is large landscape conservation. And this is a topic that's getting a lot of attention nationally. It's a topic that we spend quite a bit of time on at our Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. We've been involved in helping to convene and organize the Roundtable on the Crown of the Continent, and a newer entity, which is a network of practitioners working on large landscape scales throughout the country. More information on those are available at our website, which I've also posted up here on the whiteboard. So the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative is part of a national network of public-private partnerships aimed at encouraging science-based collaboration across political and other boundaries. We'll be hearing about this today from our speaker, Yvette Converse, who directs the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative, the GNLCC. Yvette was educated at Utah State University, where she got her master's in aquatic ecology and watershed science. And she's worked for 15 years in endangered fish recovery, both in the public and the private sector. We're very fortunate to have Yvette here from Bozeman today. Please welcome me in joining her. Welcome. Join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate being here, and I just want to say right from the start that a number of you probably have more experience and understanding of landscape conservation than I do. My background, as Sarah said, is in aquatics, and I spent most of my the last 15 to 20 years of my career looking at endangered species conservation, endangered fish conservation in Utah, and did my master's in the Grand Canyon. So I moved to Bozeman, Montana in 2004 and worked at the Fish Technology Center there as the assistant director. Until I took this position 2 years ago. And this is fairly new for me, but I have a pretty broad experience working with intergovernmental collaborations and partnerships, and that's really what I was bringing to the table. So if I do get specific questions about landscape conservation, I'll probably direct them back to some of you folks in the audience who know a lot of that better than me, but I can certainly talk about this directive that we're working under. And this is a government-initiated effort, but we'll talk a little bit about why that's relevant now, what that might mean for all of us in the non-government sector as well. So I don't think it's any surprise, and everyone's been talking about these things for a number of years now, but it's always slow to come to government. There's a number of issues happening at the landscape scale, at the global scale really, that we're all starting to learn to deal with in the sector of natural resource management. Certainly climate change is one of those. Whether you believe in what causes climate change or the pace of climate change that's occurring is up to you. But it's certainly something that we're seeing around the landscape today and we have to deal with. And so certainly broader than any of our jurisdictions within a specific government agency or a specific NGO or state international province. We have to deal with these things collectively. Other things like invasive species that are affecting the landscape on a very broad scale, and issues like land use change, energy development, and that's not just things like oil and gas, but broader land use energy development like wind farms and those kinds of things that have real landscape scale effect. So the pace of these things is really unprecedented in the last 100 years of modern conservation, and we're really just beginning to learn how to deal with those, if we are at all. So a lot of this is a response to those things. Other things that are happening are changes in technological advances. As most of you are aware, 10 years ago, most of us didn't even have cell phones. And nowadays, we all have cell phones, and we all have better computers. The technology changes have really advanced what we can do with information and data. This is a good thing because it creates a lot of opportunity, but it also creates an expectation from the public when they know that we have the ability to move information around and share information, and we're not sharing it in the way that we possibly could or should. And part of that is an infrastructure, part of it's institutional obstacles, and those are things that we deal with in our organizations. And these are certainly some of the obstacles to making progress in these things. So if you think about sort of traditionally how we've managed the land, and let's just say this is a particular state or some geographic area, and we have jurisdictions within that we manage for. It may be a park unit, like a glacier, or it may be a BLM field office that's managing a section of Bureau of Land Management land, or a forest land management unit. These days, we're managing these a lot more like this because our jurisdictions are overlapping. These agencies all don't do the same thing, but they often have responsibilities for the same things that have a lot of overlap, and we have to learn how to do that. So this model of managing the land no longer exists, and now we're trying to figure out what this means geographically, jurisdictionally, operationally, institutionally, and it's a lot about coordination, communication, collaboration. Those words actually are much more difficult to do than you would think among specifically the government agencies, but then you start to intertwine with non-government agencies and it becomes even more difficult. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Our main responsibilities are for things like endangered species, national wildlife refuges, migratory birds, and other specific, what we call trust resources that we've been assigned from Congress and from the public. The Fish and Wildlife Service has, for the last 10 or so years, been thinking about landscape conservation, as all our agencies have, in different ways, and I'll explain a little bit about why some of that has evolved the way it has. We've been thinking a lot about adaptive management. That's another one of those terms that's getting thrown around a lot these days, and really it's about not just doing trial and error, but sort of planning, designing, implementing, and then monitoring your effectiveness. And certainly the other agencies are all thinking about this as well. Our model of how we started to think about that, we coined strategic habitat conservation, and it actually grew out of some of these models that come out of the non-government sector and from the academic worlds. And another thing that came on our radar was climate change. A lot of this was because of things that were going on in the polar zones with petitions to list polar bear or other issues that were causing us to have to deal with climate change at a time when our administration was not really interested in talking about it. And so we started to sort of bring together some planning documents and that kind of thing. But we're just one agency, a very small one, in fact, among a number of bureaus within the Department of Interior, and then outside of the Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture that houses the U.S. Forest Service as well as Natural Resource Conservation Service. And then outside of that, you have Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency. It goes on. And those are just federal agencies. You think about our state governments that have equal tiers of agencies layered for jurisdictions within their, for issues within their jurisdiction. And each of these, as well as partnerships, non-government organizations, and the list goes on, have developed their own sort of ways of how to approach this. So now the question becomes, how do we really fit these together so we're working on these things collectively and not individually? It's within our institutional history to work on these in a sort of siloed approach because we had specific management mandates that we had to deal with. For example, the Fish and Wildlife Service dealing with endangered species, or the Bureau of Land Management dealing with things like ranching or mining. But now we have to deal with those things together collectively. So why the need for something like an LCC? And I'm not suggesting landscape conservation cooperatives are the only way to do this. It's just one spoke in the wheel, possibly, if you think about it like that. There's a report that actually Matt McKinney was one of the primary authors on called Large Landscape Conservation, a strategic framework for policy and action that came out of the Lincoln Institute. It actually developed out of a forum that was a combination of government and non-government organizations sitting down and talking about some of these problems. And what they identified is that there's a real gap in governance and a corresponding need to create informal and formal ways to work together, okay? So that's easy to say, across boundaries. Easy to say, hard to do. Some of the barriers they identified included a lack of scientific information, a lack of capacity, which means sort of people in their positions able to do the work, lack of strategy to coordinate, and fragmented financial investments. And that means money coming down in sort of these siloed, programmatic, you know, cut off investments that are not necessarily corresponding with each other or intending to complement each other. Now, this isn't to say that we don't have a lot of science out there. There's a lot of science out there, and there will always be good science coming out of this. But the point here is that perhaps we're lacking the specific strategic science that we need to address these kinds of problems, where we've actually thought about in advance what we're trying to look at, how we're trying to project this, and then how do we get that right kind of information. And we're certainly not lacking capacity, but what we're lacking is maybe the specific kind of capacity that we need to deal with these kinds of problems, and so on. In the report that the Lincoln Institute put together, it identifies funding that comes down from the federal government. This is just federal government, and I'm sure it's not a comprehensive list, but it's pretty impressive. These are conservation, we call it conservation delivery. It means conservation for on-the-ground actions. There's billions of dollars coming down for conservation action. The small amount of money that we're getting for these LCCs is really about how to direct and how to coordinate these dollars. It's not about how to add one drop to the bucket. Okay, so what we're trying to do is focus a specific small amount of money and programmatic capacity towards making these things fit together more effectively on the ground. Another thing that sort of happened, in some ways serendipitously, but certainly was intended by the Department of Interior, was that Deputy Secretary David Hayes had a big agenda for climate change, certainly different than the previous administration, and looked around at the various efforts going on within the government agencies and saw a few things that he felt had some promise. The LCCs in particular, I think because it was about bringing multiple organizations and agencies together, was one that he sort of latched onto as a possible way to deal with things like climate change. So in the Department of Interior, which is Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Indian Affairs, that's our sort of overarching agency that we answer to. They developed what they called a collective response, adaptive response to climate change, and in that they called out LCCs in a secretarial order as one way to sort of deal with that. So this put us sort of into the genre of how do we deal with climate change, but it's not the really the only or even necessarily the initial reason for LCCs coming out of the gate. This isn't really my area. Like I said, my background is in aquatics, but I do recall a few things from my grad school days, and you can look at sort of your history of classic literature and landscape conservation and how theory has evolved over time for landscape conservation, starting with island biogeography and up until what you're looking at today, and discussions about core areas and corridors. And it's been a really interesting discussion. It really has taken decades for some of this information to really work its way into government, and that's I think pretty standard. Government is a big ship that's really hard to turn, and so it takes sometimes decades for this kind of stuff to work its way into the way we do, into our bureaucracies and into our policies and the way we do business. But the positive thing is that it's there, and we have this opportunity to try to respond to it. So what we're really talking about is a matter of scale. How do we consider the landscape scale effects or the stressors that are happening that are outside of the realm of the ecosystems or the ecology that we're thinking about, and how do we make them relevant to the ecosystems and the functions and processes of those ecosystems and to the species or the outcomes that we want to see out there on the landscape. So just as an example, some of the ecological processes and functions that we really look at, this isn't necessarily a comprehensive list, but you know, some of the things that we think about when we think about ecosystem process and function. So you might say, we're looking at here on the right side of the screen, a continental view of landscape down to maybe more of a ecotypic area like the Rocky Mountains down to more of an ecosystem like Yellowstone. Oops, sorry, I didn't realize there was some animation in here. But so really thinking about these landscape stressors, thinking about the processes that are affected, and then thinking about the species at the ground level. So what we're trying to do in a lot of ways is bring the science to the level of conservation that is enacted. In other words, conservation happens at a very small scale on the landscape. We don't go out and do broad, multi-state level conservation actions. It just doesn't work that way. We have no way to do that, and it's not really effective. We do conservation like this at the bottom. This is Centennial Valley, which is kind of Red Rocks National Wildlife Refuge. It connects Yellowstone National Park to the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, two big, large protected ecosystems, and is an important corridor for wildlife. And so, you know, we think about how do we keep bears from one area to the other, or any other kind of wildlife, Wolverine or trumpeter swan or whatever your species might be. We enact conservation at the very local level, not talking about land parcels, restoration, easements, acquisitions, or other methods. But we need the science to inform that, and we also need to understand the ecological processes and the landscape scale stressors. So in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a number of initiatives that have started up, probably initially in the non-government sector and now infiltrating into the government sector, things like Yellowstone to Yukon, things like Center for Large Landscape Conservation, Freedom to Roam, Path of the Pronghorn, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all sort of a natural response to this kind of information that's coming out. So LCCs is another way to think about this. It's certainly what the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to the Department of Interior, and then the Department of Interior took and asked a number of other agencies and organizations to become part of. It's based on an ecosystem sort of segmentation of the continent, so it's a continental approach, but broken out by ecoregions. A little bit about bird conservation regions, if you're familiar with those, but also ecoregions and river basins. So the Great Northern Area, which was assigned, is really Bird Conservation Region 10 with the Upper Peninsula of 9. So this is the map that was proposed for this LCC framework nationwide, and keep in mind this is sort of a government geographic framework. It doesn't mean this is how we have to do work, but it allows us to think about things in a more ecological way rather than by state boundaries or by other jurisdictional boundaries. Of course, the complication there is that nobody fits into any one of those, so it makes things a lot more complicated organizationally. So this is the Great Northern Area, and I kind of put this blurry line around it to indicate that the work that we're trying to do isn't by any means intended to follow the delicate curves of the boundaries here by any means. So we certainly support work that carries over into other LCCs neighboring or even regions of the country. The point here is that it's relevant to us at that landscape scale. We developed a goal statement early on, and I'll talk a little bit more about the structure of the partnership after this, but I think the real interesting part about this is that we had 20 to 30 regional and state, tribal, and NGO executives together talking about what is our common goal here, and this is kind of an operational goal. And the idea initially was folks were really concerned about stepping on each other's toes, one agency telling another what to do. So it's a little bit of a reactive goal, but the nice thing about it is it does talk about the value of large landscape. It talks about resilience in the face of climate change, and those are some pretty big words for some agencies to take on in print. So we see that as a good thing. What we wanted to do, though, was specify that what this alliance, this Great Northern LCC, was going to do was really work at the level of science support, coordination, informing conservation action, et cetera. We weren't going to make regionalized decisions or that kind of thing, because that gets really tough for some organizations. But it does open up I guess, the possibilities for the future of how we start to think about these problems together. So one of the things that's unique about the Great Northern Area is that we have quite a few existing landscape partnerships. And of course, landscape, it's all about scale, so you can think about those in, at different scales. But and these are just a few that sort of came to me at the top of my head. There's a lot more than this. But these are all already ongoing partnerships doing landscape conservation on the ground for various issues. They might be species-based, they might be place-based, or issue-based problems. And so we really wanted to tap into, I guess, the effort and the momentum that these organizations, these partnerships already had going. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. What we're really trying to do is network these efforts into something that collectively makes sense. So we do have a steering committee that mainly comprises regional executives. We have myself and a couple others as staff. We have an advisory team, and John Haber with the Forest Service in the back of the room here is on that advisory team as well, of about 15 to 20 or so folks from different agencies and organizations that help inform how we move forward. We recognize there's a science community out there that includes the universities as well as the science arms of many of the government agencies. And we trying to recognize the value of those landscape partnerships at the bottom by saying there's a partnership community, and they might be loosely organized into what we're calling the Columbia Basin, the Sage Steppe, and the Rocky Mountain Forums. This is just kind of a rundown of our steering committee, so you can see it's pretty broad at this point. Now, you know, we have folks from British Columbia and Alberta, from Parks Canada, states of Montana, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, the federal agencies, and the list right now is sort of fluctuating. So we have some folks that are really engaged and interested, and some that are sort of waiting to see, some that are there just to kind of police activities and make sure we're not trying to do anything that's going to cause them any problems. But the real tangible point is that we have them there in the room, and it's a good opportunity to discuss some of these things. So people are still coming to the table. Early on, we wanted to do a sort of real general science assessment, you know, talking about, looking through the lens of landscape scale issues. What are some of the information needs that rise to the top? Certainly information about climate change was one of those. Land cover data, not just sort of, you know, sort of like satellite imagery, but how do we start to compile, work together, standardize, come to terms with the huge amounts of land data that's out there. Data management and interfacing. How do we make our data systems talk to each other, work together? How can we analyze these things collectively? How can we work off a shared information base that we agree on? Habitat connectivity, certainly in this part of the world, is a huge issue, both terrestrial and aquatic. Vulnerability assessments, and that's just measuring the vulnerability of our resources to some of these landscape stressors. And then monitoring and evaluation is a big issue, because it's often the first thing to get cut off of anybody's budget, so we never really do a good job of monitoring and understanding the effects that our programs are having. Another thing that we did early on was look at the state wildlife action plans. This is partly in response to the states voicing their concern that we weren't, you know, in this part of the country, there's a big state-fed I guess, rub. And so that carries on a lot of baggage from things like grizzly bears and wolves and endangered species listings, and that have caused the states a lot of burden and additional effort that they have to put into managing endangered species. And it is quite a bit of work to do that. But it's also about, you know, who manages the resources. Is it a federal resource? Is it a state resource? Who's in charge? And that creates a little bit of rub. And then, of course, we're in the red-blue state zone. We're here where we have a lot of Western states politics, and federal government isn't necessarily part of their political agenda. And so it's a little bit tough initially to, at the highest levels, like when you start talking at the governor's level or the director's level, to really sit down and talk face-to-face about how do we manage resources across these boundaries. But when you really talk on at the level of working with your field office personnel, we work with the state folks all the time, and they work with the federal people, and it's really not an issue. But it was brought up right out of the gate that state wildlife action plans, which are something the states put together in response to getting federal dollars to help them manage species of greatest conservation need, they put a lot of work into those, and they were asked to do that by the Fish and Wildlife Service years ago as part of a way for them to be more strategic about how they manage species of greatest conservation need. And by that we mean species that are generally non-game. So game species are usually managed through funds that come from hunting and fishing licensing fees, or some federal tax dollars that come down for hunting and fishing. But other species that aren't hunted often fall through the cracks, and that's been a problem for decades. And so there is federal dollars available for those, and the states have to put together these what we call SWAPs, or State Wildlife Action Plans. And so after putting those together, and then we came to the table and said, now we have this LCC program and we'd like you to be part of it, the first thing they said was, well, wait a minute, we've already put a lot of effort into these State Wildlife Action Plans, so we want you to look at those. So we did, and we really just analyzed what we had in common across the landscape. Pretty simple analysis, but we see a list of species here, and I know you probably can't read it, but they're the ones that you might expect to see. Things like sage grouse and trumpeter swan and grizzly bear and wolverine, and mainly the species that we consider to be candidate or listed or somehow sensitive to what's going on out there. Another thing we did was look at all these partnerships that are out there on the ground, and these can be, like I said, they're multi-organizational partnerships already going, and we looked at what their priorities were. And so I know you can't read this as well, but the point is we kind of analyzed them by species, by ecosystem, by habitat, by landscape issue to determine what they had in common. So we used all that information to try to develop this strategic approach. And in fact, just last week we had a workshop with about 25 folks from different agencies and organizations, which we called our advisory team, drafting our vision statement. And the reason, you know, I'm not into big visioning exercises. I think sometimes they can take a lot of time and then no one ever really looks at the vision. But the point here, people need to know what we're rallying around. What's our common idea of what this landscape is going to look like? Because if we start to move forward collectively trying to work towards some landscape conservation vision, we have to sort of all agree as to what that is going to be. And that helps us sift through things like differences in values, differences in jurisdiction and operational mandates. So currently, right now, our vision is drafted something like this. And it's pretty simple, and we did that intentionally because we also want you know, the public, the laymen, to really be able to embrace this idea, not to alienate them with a lot of like ecological terms that they might not understand. So it's really about sustaining diverse natural systems that include, you know, all the components that we think they should include, and that we do that through collaborative science, conservation, and management. Pretty simple. A lot more simple to say than to do. The components of that are really ecological integrity, and some people call ecological health. What does that mean? How do we measure it? Aquatic integrity, terrestrial integrity. We've been, you know, debating and sort of sifting through these kinds of discussions for years, if not decades. So what we've decided to do is kind of look at the priorities that we saw common to these kinds of things: species, ecosystems, habitats, stressors, and sort of put them into some very simple conceptual model. And this is all sort of draft. Like literally, we've been doing this over the last couple weeks. So we've had a couple years to start to develop these relationships. So it's taken us this far to really get to this point. And really just kind of drawing the relationships between the stressors that might occur, like say, for example, I'm going to just pull this up, climate change, and how that might act out on the template of ecosystems, habitats, and species. To get there, we kind of use those broad landscape scale priorities, if you want to call it that, in those hierarchical categories: stressors, which are sort of impacting from the outside, that's how we've defined it; ecosystems, ecosystem process, habitats, and species. So for example, if you think about Wolverine, you might make a few very general statements about Wolverine and its needs. How climate change has a direct impact, how connectivity is a major issue among sort of islands of mountains, how land disturbance can have an impact, how they're food generalists. And you might look at sort of within the Rocky Mountains, some of the processes, habitats, species, and drivers, and draw a very simple diagram about what directs Wolverine or what impacts Wolverine. So the red lines are a strong direct relationship. Then you think about something like grizzly bear, which are much more of a generalist kind of species. And then the relationship is a lot more complicated. So we can sort of use these really simple kinds of conceptual models to say which of these hierarchical levels are affecting the others, and which can we sort of measure on the ground to look for response to some of these broader things. Now, okay, so I already showed you this, so looking through the lens of climate change. Now, the idea here isn't that we're going to, we're going to, within this landscape initiative, go out and measure these things. But what we can do is roll up our programs, agree to some common priorities, and try to bring that information into all of our programs collectively, so that when we go out and do our actions on the ground, we have that in mind and we can have that a landscape impact. It's not going to be an easy thing, and I'm sure by the time you guys are up here in my job and other folks' jobs, it will be a lot different and hopefully better. But it's a start, and it's certainly a different place than we've been for the last 10 or 15 years. So I'm just going to quickly go through some examples of the kinds of projects that we are funding right now to give you an idea, and hopefully you'll start to see how these things fit within sort of a what we're trying to get here is sort of a broad information base that people can share and create this kind of network of information that feeds in at the landscape scale. So this one is Dr. Rick Hauer is here. This is actually a project he works on with Clint Maufeld from the USGS that's a pilot aquatic vulnerability work on the North Fork of the Flathead. But I'm just going to point out that this includes sort of a geospatial component. So we got the land layers, we got habitat classification, we have kind of a landscape effect layer like climate analysis, or you might look at invasive species or something like that. Then you look at your target species, like in this case it might be cutthroat or bull trout, and you validate the models for that information. And I'm going to just use that same template to show you this is fine-scale linkage work that's also done out of University of Montana. Dr. Chris Servine kind of oversees the project, but it's actually, somebody tell me, who is it that does the work at UM? It's not Chris. Nobody, this a grizzly bear researcher here. You guys don't know, okay. Sorry, I don't have his name, but he's a professor here at University of Montana. And basically we have the same kind of thing. We have the spatial data, we have the some kind of an ecological modeling, species validation. Another example is the Washington Connectivity, which is mainly oriented at providing tools to analyze things like connectivity issues, or how you might use those tools to make a land level decision. But again, we're looking at geospatial information, some kind of landscape analysis like climate change, species data, ecological modeling, and then taking that, developing some decision support system that people can use to apply to management, and then you go back and revise and adapt. So these are the kinds of projects we're funding. We're also funding things like relevant climate change information that's coming down from places like University of Washington, the Climate Impacts Group, or USGS, Steve Hostetler at Corvallis, or other, a lot of other good information that's coming down about climate change. Some of the other things we're working on is trying to get some of these agencies to work together. Each of them is sort of doing this, developing their own decision support tools, and by that we mean some kind of, computer system that they can use to help them prioritize or identify vulnerabilities, and they can use that and weigh that against what they have to do or what their decisions are to help them make better decisions. We're never going to get them all to come up with one decision support tool to use, but what we can do is collaborate on things like the data layers. So we're using the same ones, we're using the same wildlife distribution models, or we're using the same wildlife data. Those kinds of things. And so in this particular example, we've got the Bureau of Land Management doing the Middle Rockies Rapid Ecological Assessment. We have the Forest Service and a decision support system that they're working on that may be changing through time. We have the Western Governors Association, which is an alliance of 17 Western states that are working on corridors and core areas. And Heart of the Rockies Initiative, which is an alliance of 25 land trusts through the Rocky Mountains that have all sort of developed ways to prioritize on-the-ground actions. And we're asking them to think about the data layers and how do we coordinate those and actually share that information, which sounds like it should be easy, but it's not. Another thing that we're doing is developing this, what we call LC map, and it's really a geospatial analysis portal. So this allows people to kind of virtually share analysis through the cloud space and do that work that they otherwise would have had to download static information. It grows old on your computer. It's hard to move around. You change it. Somebody else maybe didn't get those changes. That's a big problem to how we share information. So something like a portal that uses cloud space is a real advantage. But now we're dealing with things like security and how do we, what are our IT policies across our respective agencies, and are we allowed to share information on these kinds of things? But we're working through that. We also, if you visit our website, and I hope you will, we've sort of going to keep track of the projects that we're funding to kind of describe the tools and products that are coming out of those, hopefully over time show how these things can be woven together into a shared information base. And this is to no way imply that this is the only information that matters. This is just sort of a start. We certainly did some cherry picking to find things that were hitching our wagon to some good ongoing work. We also had to do a little bit of spreading the wealth to make people happy and bring them into the circle. But we hope this kind of grows into more momentum with our university partners as well as our government science partners and our non-government science partners. And we have a range of those funded. It's federal, state, tribal, non-government, Canadian, province. So there's a range of projects that have been funded, but you can see that on our site. We also have, so in addition to our website, we have newsletters and resource directory and some other things, webinars that we've been hosting. And certainly we're not the only ones doing those kinds of things, but if you want to learn more about it, this is a good way to do it. And you can sign up for these if you check out our website. Most of the information you need is there.